then who will be for me? The question of identity. If I am only for myself, then what am I? The question of belonging. We ask these questions all the way through our lives. So your memories of youth, of adolescence, vivid, terrible, persistent, are the memories that we take with us all the way through life, negotiating the shoals of individuality and belonging, of principle and person. These are important things. The psychologist Erik Erikson wrote once, each youth must form some central perspective and direction, some working unity out of the remnants of childhood and the hopes of anticipated adulthood. There you go. I'm closing in on 60 and I'm still working on that. People tell me, why did you elect to be a clergyman? I said, well, I'm only doing this till I figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And how many of you have had that feeling too, that it's always provisional, that something else might happen, that you're never quite sure? And I want to celebrate that not quite sureness. I want to honor that, because that's part of what it is to be part of a liberal church, is the willingness to grow and change. But it also means being never quite sure about anything. That's a rough place to live. Who would volunteer for it? I know I didn't. It's just the way I'm built. Which is why youth and adolescence really is a spiritual crisis as well as an identity crisis. Some of you know that this church was organized as Fountain Street Baptist Church. Behind those panels there used to be a tank into which people were ritually plunked from time to time to do their baptism, because as we all know, Baptists baptize in a really big way. Head to toe, baptism by immersion, clergy and hip waiters. That's what it was all about. But people forget that's not really what it means to be Baptist. Baptists got that name not for full immersion baptism, but for what is called believer's baptism. They thought one should not be baptized into the church until you had decided of your own will to be a Christian, that baptizing babies was completely preposterous. In other words, the Baptists were wise enough to know that until you can make a spiritual decision for yourself, it really shouldn't be celebrated. You should make that choice. And we still have that tradition here, that we believe you shouldn't join this church until you want to, until you know what you're getting into. In my smart alecky ways, and I know I am too much of a smart aleck for my own good, and you know that too. I tell people that you should only join this church until you're willing to admit that these are the scoundrels you're willing to be associated with in public. And I say that with a little cheek, but I also say it because Billy Graham put it well once. He said, and it's the only thing he ever said that I agreed with, by the way, but he's right. He said, if you ever find the perfect church, don't join it, because then it won't be. Churches cannot be any more perfect than any one of their members. So the crisis of belonging and identity. Here's a church. We celebrate your right to choose to be whatever you want to be. You can change your mind every week. But I think one of the risks we have as a church, as a liberal faith, is that we encourage people to stay teenagers in their hearts for the rest of their lives. Someone has described liberal religion as the place where you're not the boss of me. Pretty much like your 15-year-old, right? And I got to tell you, the world has enough actual 15-year-olds in it. It doesn't need a few extra millions more. So I think that's a challenge for us as a liberal church, not to get stuck in an adolescent rut, not to let our personal desire to be rebellious keep us from making adult decisions. But that's another sermon. What I want to talk about now is how kids of that age, and we were all kids that age once, despite our children who look at us disbelievingly when we said we were once teenagers, is that the crisis we all felt as teenagers really is a religious crisis. To try to resolve the question of who am I, what am I, What am I here for? And I chose this title because it comes from a man whose book I read, Stephen Howard Mitchell, an African-American preacher, who said that in the African-American tradition, the question of who are you is never as important as whose are you? To whom do you belong? In marginalized communities, minority communities, your belonging to that group is as much a part of your identity as your individuality. It's those of us who would live in the privileged place of being mostly white, mostly middle class, speaking English, male, straight, mostly, who can afford to think of ourselves as purely individuals in communities of color, among women, among gays and straight and gay folk, among those of ethnic or religious differences. The belonging to a group is key to their identity, so that tension is more defined for them than it is for you and for me. And to some extent, that makes it easier. But I'm pointing out here that whose you are is a question even for us. That the relative liberty of being able to be a solitary individual might be a little bit delusional. We may think that we're completely separate, that we can make our own way, the captain of my own soul, I am in charge of my own life. But guess what? Every act you make has an effect on other people. It really does. And the failure to reckon whose you are along with who you are is a perfectly adolescent assumption that we need to deal with individually and collectively. I thought about that, and I thought about the tragedy at Fort Hood and the vote in Maine, that sometimes we use groups to define individuals in a brutal way, and that sometimes individuals withdraw from groups in a brutal way themselves. We should be more honest about how difficult this is, here and elsewhere. At what price? What price are we willing to pay to be completely individual? At what price are we able to be part of a group? And these are spiritual questions because they settle on, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, then what am I? The question never goes away. In my opinion now, liberal religion tends to be almost dogmatic about individuality to the point of individualism, that it's an ideology with us. Not only can you be an individual, you had better be an individual. As Will Rogers once said, he belonged to no organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And I sometimes say I belong to no organized church. I go to Fountain Street. We're so busy being individuals that it's hard to find the common ground. In fact, we sometimes resist it. And it's my task, furtively, frenetically, badly, to try to articulate ways we can be together without surrendering your solitary reality. That's a huge challenge. I can't rely upon a mythology or a book or a catechism or a creed to kind of shove you into the room. That's why they call this like herding cats. Can't bring you in the same room. Of course, you can herd a few cats if you have really good cat food for a while. But I digress. What I'm talking about today is that identity in isolation from others is not an identity. Spiritual, political, personal, emotional. If the only way you can be you is to have no one else around, you have no identity. Identity, spiritual, political, personal, or otherwise, has to be an identity in the midst of other people. I am a son in my family, not the father. I am the father of my son, not my son. How many parents do you know who try to be their kids' best friends? How often does that work? Not so well. You got to be the parent when you're the parent. You have to be the son when you're the son. You have to be the mate when you're the spouse. You have to be the citizen when the nation asks you. You need to be faithful when you're part of a church. We have to know our roles and own them as being legitimate roles.